Monday morning. The sun wasn't even fully up when I discovered it. Concrete barriers, massive, gray, and imposing, blocking the main road to my farm. A bright red sign gleamed in the early light. No agricultural vehicles by HOA order. My heart sank. Then rage boiled up. 3 generations of my family had worked this land. Blood, sweat, and tears poured into every acre. Now some fancy subdivision committee thought they could force me out. I stood there, clutching my coffee mug so tight I thought it might shatter. The HOA had finally crossed the line. They wanted war? Fine. They'd get one. What they didn't know, I had access to a fleet of tractors, combines, and harvesters, all perfectly legal on public roads, all painfully slow. And just 24 hours later, a line of luxury cars, BMWs, Mercedes, and Audis sat trapped behind my parade of farm equipment, their horns blaring uselessly as my tractors crawled at 15 mph during their morning commute. The names: Frank Miller, 62 years old, with hands rough as bark and a back that protests every morning but never quits. This land, all 180 acres of it, has been my world for over 4 decades. Before me, it was my father's world, and before him, my grandfather's. Our farmhouse, built in 1924, stands as a testament to family legacy. The wooden beams inside were cut from trees that once grew where our apple orchard now thrives. Every nail, every floorboard tells a story of the Miller family. Long before any housing development even existed on a blueprint, we were here growing corn, raising cattle, and living by the seasons. I remember when the horizon was nothing but open fields and forest. Now, luxury homes with manicured lawns press against my property line like unwelcome guests who've overstayed their welcome. Enter Janet Winters, the new HOA president with her designer suits and Mercedes SUV, a former real estate executive from Chicago who retired to our little corner of rural America 2 years ago. Her perfectly highlighted hair always seems unmoved by wind, much like her opinions are unmoved by reason. Community modernization is her favorite phrase. Sounds nice, doesn't it? What it actually means is transforming everything into a picture-perfect suburban paradise, where property values reign supreme and century-old farms are simply eyesores to be eliminated. Our troubles began last spring. A formal letter arrived in my mailbox, printed on expensive cream-colored paper, with the Willow Creek Estates HOA letterhead. My tractors and combines, the letter stated, failed to meet the aesthetic standards of our community. I laughed at first. These machines weren't lawn ornaments, they were my livelihood. 2 weeks later, Janet called an emergency HOA meeting. I attended out of curiosity and found myself the unwitting star of a public flogging. Mr. Miller's farm equipment creates excessive noise pollution, Janet declared to the room of nodding homeowners. The dust affects our air quality, and frankly, the constant rumbling of machinery has become intolerable for residents trying to enjoy their retirement. Some neighbors I'd known for years couldn't meet my eyes. Others, mostly newcomers, glared as if I'd personally offended them by existing before they arrived. I'm not unreasonable. I tried compromising. Built a taller fence along the property line facing the subdivision. Adjusted my working hours to start later and finish earlier. Even invested in newer, quieter equipment that nearly bankrupted me. None of it satisfied Janet. "Your efforts are appreciated," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes, "but simply insufficient for our community standards." Then came the bombshell. Janet's husband, Richard Winters, sat on the County Planning Commission. A coincidence she leveraged with surgical precision. Through a series of closed-door meetings and technical reclassifications, They managed to redesignate the main access road to my farm as a residential thoroughfare, effectively banning agricultural vehicles. This wasn't about noise anymore. It wasn't about dust or aesthetics. This was a calculated move to force me to sell. Without access for my equipment, how could I farm? Without farming, how could I afford the property taxes on 180 acres? Janet wanted my land, and she'd just played her trump card. The concrete barriers appeared overnight. Massive gray slabs blocking the farm access road, my lifeline just 2 weeks before harvest season. My heart nearly stopped when I saw them. 40 acres of corn ready for picking, and suddenly no way to get my combine harvester through. I called the county immediately. The receptionist sounded sympathetic but helpless. "The road has been reclassified, Mr. Miller." The HOA filed all the proper paperwork. That evening, a cream-colored envelope appeared in my mailbox. An invitation, no, a summons to a community reconciliation meeting at the Willow Creek Estates Clubhouse. 7 o'clock sharp. Business casual attire requested. I knew a trap when I saw one. But what choice did I have? The clubhouse gleamed with polished marble and crystal chandeliers paid for by HOA fees that had tripled since Janet took over. 20 residents sat in neat rows of chairs, faces I barely recognized despite being their neighbor for decades. Janet stood at a podium, a PowerPoint presentation queued up behind her. "Frank," she smiled with practiced warmth, "we're so glad you could join us. We're here to find a solution that works for everyone." The presentation began. Slides showing property values, charts displaying noise complaints, photos of dust on patio furniture all blamed on my farm. Then came the compromise. "We've drafted a good neighbor agreement," Janet explained, sliding a thick document across the table. "Simple guidelines to help us coexist harmoniously." I flipped through the pages, my blood pressure rising with each turn. The simple guidelines included agricultural operations restricted to 10 a.m., 4 p.m., Monday through Friday only. No machinery within 500 feet of the subdivision boundary. Monthly inspections of my property by the HOA Aesthetic Compliance Committee. A requirement to plant visual buffer vegetation at my own expense trees that would take years to grow and cost thousands. "This is impossible," I said, pushing the document away. "You're asking me to farm without machinery, during the hottest part of the day, and only on weekdays. Crops don't follow HOA schedules." Janet's smile tightened. We understand farming has challenges, but our residents deserve peace and tranquility. That's why they chose Willow Creek Estates. I was here 50 years before Willow Creek existed, I reminded her. Richard Winters, Janet's husband, cleared his throat. "Progress happens, Frank. You can either adapt or..." He left the sentence hanging, but his meaning was clear. I stood up, chair scraping against the marble floor. "I'll be consulting my lawyer." "Of course," Janet nodded. "But remember, every day your harvest sits in the field, you're losing money. We're offering a reasonable solution." I walked out, their whispers following me like hornets. That night, sleep evaded me. The farm had been my family's life for generations. Now, some newcomers with fancy titles and expensive cars thought they could legislate me out of existence. Dawn found me at my kitchen table, surrounded by legal documents, county ordinances, and agricultural regulations. And then I found it buried in the Transportation Code, Section 18.4. 3. Agricultural vehicles maintaining proper safety equipment are permitted on all county-classified public roads, provided they do not exceed posted weight limits. The HOA could block my private access road, but they couldn't stop me from using public streets. The main road through Willow Creek Estates was county maintained. It was narrower than my usual route, would take longer, and would be a tight fit for my equipment, but it was legal. I called my old friend, Sheriff Mike Thompson, to confirm. "They're playing dirty, Frank," he said after hearing my story. "But yes, as long as your equipment meets safety standards and weight requirements, they can't stop you from using county roads." A plan formed in my mind. The HOA residents, particularly Janet and her executive committee, all left for work between 7:30 and 8:30 a.m. Most worked in the city, a 45-minute drive away. Their precious commute times were sacred. Janet herself had once proposed a neighborhood schedule to ensure driveways were cleared in sequence to prevent traffic backups. I spent the next 3 days preparing. My son Tom came over to help inspect every piece of equipment: headlights, taillights, turn signals, reflective tape, slow-moving vehicle emblems. Everything had to be perfect. We checked weight limits and measured clearances. I even had my grandson create a detailed route map with timing estimates. On Monday morning, I woke at 4 a.m. By 5:30, I had positioned my fleet at the farm's back entrance, an old dirt road that connected to the county highway. 3 combines, 2 tractors pulling grain carts, and my largest fertilizer spreader. All clean, all legal, all painfully slow. At precisely 7:25 a.m., I pulled out onto the main road through Willow Creek Estates in my oldest, most reliable John Deere tractor. Maximum speed, 18 miles per hour. Behind me, a convoy of farm equipment stretched nearly a quarter mile, each vehicle driven by friends and family who'd rallied to my cause. The first luxury car appeared in my rearview mirror at 7:32, a black Tesla belonging to Richard Winters. I watched his face transform from confusion to recognition to rage. He honked. I waved politely and continued at my legal pace. By 7:45, a line of at least 15 vehicles had formed behind us. BMWs, Audis, Mercedes, the entire executive committee of the HOA trapped in their German-engineered cages, going nowhere fast. Some tried to pass, only to encounter oncoming traffic and hastily swerve back in line. At 8:15, Janet herself pulled alongside in the oncoming lane, rolling down her window and gesturing frantically for me to pull over. I pointed to my ear and shrugged, pretending I couldn't hear over the tractor's engine. She eventually had to fall back in line when another car approached. We proceeded through the winding roads of Willow Creek Estates at a stately 15 mph, observing every stop sign with exaggerated care, using turn signals with precision, and waving cheerfully to confused residents who came out to see the commotion. By 9 a.m., we had completed our journey through the subdivision. Behind us, dozens of late-for-work executives sat fuming in their cars. As I turned onto the highway toward my fields, I caught sight of Janet standing beside her car, phone pressed to her ear, face contorted with fury. I knew there would be consequences. Complaints would be filed, meetings would be called, but for now, I had crops to harvest and a perfectly legal route to do it. And tomorrow? Well, harvest season lasts 3 weeks, and I had a lot of equipment that needed to use that road. The morning after my first convoy through Willow Creek Estates, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years called to offer support. Local farmers left voicemails pledging their equipment and time. Even my lawyer sounded impressed, though he cautioned me about potential escalation. "They won't take this lying down, Frank," he warned. "Janet Winters isn't used to losing." He was right. By noon, A cease and desist letter arrived by courier, printed on expensive legal letterhead from Winters and Associates, Janet's husband's law firm. The language was deliberately intimidating, full of threats about obstruction of traffic, public nuisance, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I handed it to my lawyer, who chuckled. "They've got nothing. You're operating within the law." That evening, a news van from the local station pulled into my driveway. A young reporter with eager eyes introduced herself as Melissa Chen. "We've heard about the dispute between your farm and Willow Creek Estates," she said. "Would you care to comment?" I hesitated, then invited her in for coffee. My kitchen table, scratched and worn from decades of family meals, stood in stark contrast to her sleek recording equipment. For an hour I told my story, not with anger, but with the simple truth of a man fighting to preserve his heritage. "My grandfather cleared this land by hand," I explained, showing her faded photographs. "My father expanded it during the Depression, when everyone said he was crazy to buy more acreage. I've worked it for 42 years. This isn't just property, it's my family's legacy." The segment aired the next evening. They juxtaposed images of my weathered hands against Janet's manicured nails, my modest farmhouse against her 600 square foot mansion. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. By dawn on day 2, 17 tractors, combines, and other farm vehicles lined my backfield. Farmers from 3 counties had come to join the convoy. Some I knew well, others were strangers united by a common cause. Many brought homemade signs. "Farmers feed America and heritage over HOAs." And we were here first. At precisely 6:45 am, we began. This time, our convoy stretched nearly half a mile. I led the procession in my oldest tractor, a 1976 John Deere that had belonged to my father. Behind me, a parade of agricultural might moved with deliberate slowness. The route took us past Janet's house, first, a calculated decision. Her Mercedes sat in the driveway, engine running. When she saw us approaching, she stormed out, designer heels sinking into her perfect lawn, her face contorted with rage as she shouted words lost beneath the rumble of diesel engines. We continued through the winding roads of Willow Creek Estates. Residents emerged from their homes, some angry, filming with their phones as evidence for complaints, but others waved supportively. An elderly couple gave us a thumbs up from their porch. A young mother explained to her curious children what farmers do. By 7:30, the traffic jam behind us had grown epic. Luxury cars lined up bumper to bumper, horns honking futilely. Some residents had abandoned their vehicles altogether, walking along the sidewalk in business attire, briefcases in hand. At 7:42, 3 police cruisers appeared, lights flashing. Sheriff Thompson himself stepped out of the lead car, approaching my tractor with a deliberately neutral expression. "Morning, Frank," he said, loud enough to be heard over the engine. "Got some complaints about traffic obstruction." I nodded respectfully. "Morning, Sheriff. We're maintaining legal speed for agricultural vehicles and observing all traffic regulations." He made a show of checking our lights, signals, and safety emblems, while Janet Winters marched up, phone in hand. "This is deliberate harassment," she shouted. "They're blocking traffic intentionally." Sheriff Thompson turned to her calmly. "Ma'am, these vehicles are legally permitted on county roads. They're properly equipped and under the speed limit, but they're doing this on purpose." Janet's voice rose an octave. "During rush hour," the sheriff shrugged. "No law against when they can operate so long as they're following regulations." He tipped his hat to me. "Drive safely, Frank." As he walked away, I heard him mutter to his deputy, "Shame about that road reclassification." Never should have happened. By day 3, news vans from the city had arrived. Our convoy had grown to 23 vehicles. Melissa Chen was back, this time with a cameraman capturing footage from multiple angles. The story had evolved from local dispute to David versus Goliath narrative. That evening, her investigative piece aired statewide. She dug deeper than I expected, uncovering connections I hadn't seen. Public records show that Willow Creek Development Corporation, owned primarily by Richard and Janet Winters, purchased 300 acres adjacent to Miller Farm last year, Melissa reported. Plans filed with the county reveal intentions to expand the subdivision with 150 new luxury homes, but only if they can acquire the Miller property to complete the road network. The camera cut to Richard Winters, leaving his office, hand raised to block the lens. No comment at this time. Then came the bombshell. Melissa had obtained emails between Richard and 3 county commissioners discussing the road reclassification. These communications, occurring outside official channels, raised serious questions about conflicts of interest and potential ethics violations, she explained. The final segment showed Janet at an HOA meeting 2 months earlier. Someone had recorded her saying, "The Miller Farm is an eyesore that's keeping our property values from reaching their potential. One way or another, we'll make sure that land becomes part of our community vision." My phone exploded with messages after the broadcast. The most surprising came from Eleanor Blackwood, the HOA vice president. Emergency meeting called for tomorrow. Many of us had no idea what Janet was doing. This isn't what we stand for. By morning, the story had reached national news. Farmers from neighboring states posted messages of solidarity, #FarmersVsHO, trended on social media. My grandson showed me memes of Janet's angry face juxtaposed with my tractor. I didn't fully understand them, but apparently millions did. The convoy that day was different. As we approached Willow Creek Estates, we found residents lining the streets, not in protest, but in support. Some held signs, "Neighbors not enemies," and "Sorry, Frank and fired Jaint." Eleanor Blackwood stood at the entrance to the subdivision, waving us down. I stopped my tractor, the convoy halting behind me. "The board voted this morning," she said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Janet has been removed as president. The road reclassification petition has been withdrawn." She handed me an envelope. "This is a formal apology from the HOA and an invitation to help us draft new bylaws that respect agricultural heritage." Behind her, a crew was already dismantling the concrete barriers that had blocked my access road. As word spread through the convoy, cheers erupted from farmers and residents alike. Melissa Chen captured it all, her camera panning across the unlikely scene of celebration. That evening, as the sun set over my fields, I sat on my porch, watching combines harvest corn along the horizon. My phone buzzed with a text from Sheriff Thompson. County Commission just voted unanimously to create an agricultural heritage protection zone. Your farm will be the first designated property. I smiled, running my hand along the weathered porch railing my grandfather had carved. Some victories aren't about winning, but about remembering what matters most. This land would remain a farm not just for me, but for generations to come. The emergency HOA meeting lasted well into the night. Through the grapevine, I heard it was contentious, with raised voices echoing through the clubhouse's marble halls. By morning, the community message board announced Janet's resignation effective immediately. No flowery language, no thanks for her service, just a terse statement and information about interim leadership. Richard Winters' downfall came more gradually, but with greater consequence. The County Ethics Commission, launched an investigation based on Melissa Chen's reporting. Within a week, he had voluntarily stepped down from the planning committee. By month's end, rumors circulated that his law firm was losing clients, particularly developers who feared association with the scandal. I took no pleasure in their professional troubles. Revenge had never been my goal. I simply wanted to protect what was mine. The concrete barriers disappeared overnight, just as mysteriously as they had appeared. My access road was clear again, ready for harvest equipment. The first morning I drove my combine down that familiar path. The feeling of rightness settled deep in my bones. This was how things should be. Eleanor Blackwood, now interim HOA president, stopped by my farmhouse on a crisp autumn afternoon. She brought apple pie homemade, not store-bought. We sat on my porch, the same porch where generations of millers had watched seasons change across these fields. "The board is drafting new bylaws," she explained, balancing her dessert plate on her knee. "We want to ensure nothing like this happens again." I nodded, appreciative but wary. Good intentions often fade with time. "Actually," she continued, "we were hoping you might serve as a consultant, help us understand how to be good neighbors to agricultural operations." The request surprised me. "I'm not much for committees and paperwork," I admitted. "Neither am I," Eleanor laughed, "but I've lived here 15 years and never knew the history of this land until I saw that news report. Many of us feel the same way, disconnected from what came before us." She paused, looking out over the harvested fields. "We'd like to change that. Spring brought unexpected developments. The new HOA leadership organized a community picnic at the boundary between Willow Creek Estates and my farm. Tables stretched along the property line, not as a barrier, but as a bridge. Residents brought dishes to share, many asking questions about farming practices and crop cycles. Children petted the horses and climbed on decommissioned tractors I'd set up for their amusement. Eleanor approached me midway through the festivities, a tall man in a suit, following behind her. "Frank, this is Congressman Davis. He's been following your story." We shook hands, his grip firm but not overbearing. "Mr. Miller, your situation highlighted a growing problem across the state: development encroaching on agricultural land without proper protections for either party." He handed me a business card. "I'm introducing legislation next month addressing these conflicts. I'd value your input." By summer, signs appeared at the entrance to Willow Creek Estates, home of the annual Heritage Harvest Festival, first Saturday in October. The planning committee, which now included 3 farmers from neighboring properties, designed an event celebrating both the subdivision's 5th anniversary and the farm's centennial. The festival exceeded everyone's expectations. Residents opened their community pool and tennis courts to visitors. Local artisans set up booths selling handmade goods. My grandson gave tractor rides to wide-eyed children who had never seen crops up close. A local historian displayed photographs of the area dating back to my grandfather's time, when all this land grew corn and soybeans. As twilight fell, Eleanor clinked a glass for attention. The crowd gathered around a makeshift stage near the property line. "Today marks a new tradition," she announced, "one that honors both where we've been and where we're going." She unveiled a bronze plaque mounted on a stone marker, "Miller Farm, established 1923." A reminder that the land we call home has always been tended with care. The applause caught me off guard, warming something inside me that had grown cold during the conflict. Later, as fireflies began to dot the evening air, I found myself sitting with a group of new neighbors on lawn chairs at the edge of my property. They asked about crop rotation, about weather patterns, about how farming had changed over my lifetime. They listened with genuine interest. One young father turned to me as his daughter dozed against his shoulder. "I bought in Willow Creek because I wanted somewhere perfect for my family," he confessed. "I never considered that perfect might mean connecting to something with deeper roots than our subdivision." I nodded, understanding. "Land remembers what we do to it," I told him. "Treat it with respect, and it gives back for generations." The next morning, I walked my fields alone as the sun rose. The dew-soaked soil felt right beneath my boots, the same soil my father and grandfather had walked before me. In the distance, the rooftops of Willow Creek Estates caught the early light. I had fought not just for my right to farm, but for something more fundamental, the understanding that progress doesn't require erasing what came before. That neighbors, despite their differences, can find common ground quite literally, in our case. As I headed back toward the farmhouse, I noticed something new at the edge of my property. Someone had planted a row of saplings along the boundary, not as a barrier, but as a living connection between past and future. A note attached to one slender trunk read simply, "For the next 100 years." I smiled, knowing I wouldn't see these trees reach maturity. But someone would, and perhaps they'd remember the story of how they came to be planted, a reminder that the most valuable harvests are sometimes measured not in bushels, but in understanding. Have you ever faced an unreasonable HOA like I did? I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the Willow Creek Estates HOA treated my family farm. Was Janet's behavior justified, or did she go too far? If you've experienced similar battles with unreasonable rules and regulations, show your support by commenting Farm Strong below. This story of standing up against injustice resonated with thousands across the country. Many of you have shared your own HOA horror stories since I first posted. Remember, sometimes the most powerful response to unfairness is simply holding your ground. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more compelling stories about rural life, property rights, and the ongoing tension between tradition and development. Next week, I'll be sharing how our Heritage Harvest Festival has grown into a regional attraction that brings together farmers and suburban families alike. Hit that notification bell to join our growing community of folks who believe in protecting what matters.